Welcome to the socio-historic context, form and structure and rhyme scheme, if there is a rhyme scheme, of Tissue. And Tissue is one of the more complicated poems in the Power and Conflict anthology. And honestly, I understand why, because it has taken me quite a few tries in order to get to this. It's a complicated poem for a reason. And I think after trying a couple of methods to start off with, I think this method might be the best way to teach Tissue and to analyse it. I think the best way to really deconstruct what Tissue is and what it means from kind of an exterior angle is to look at what tissue could mean. So what could this noun tissue mean, which is the title of the poem? What could it represent? And from going from the outside inwards, we can actually get a clearer view of what Dharker might be trying to say about tissue. So first of all, the first thing that I want to say is that I personally believe, when I read this poem, that tissue is about humanity. I personally believe that that is the main theme, I would say, or even subject of the poem. It's humanity, right? So with humanity comes, what does humanity, what is it built on? What is humanity and society built on? And reading the poem, the first word that is written is paper. And I think this is done on purpose. The fact that you've got the title Tissue and then immediately the first word is paper is incredibly important because it really represents what humanity values. Paper. Think about it. Throughout the poem, we've got references to things that are constructed from paper. Paper is the origin of buildings, structures, religious texts, family lineages, birth certificates, receipts, money. All those things start off with paper. That some of them are even made up of paper. So we've got religious texts like the Quran that's mentioned, and it's mentioned as written on paper. We've got receipts, which are made up of paper, and receipts are incredibly important because they are an example or representation of the economy. Going back to humanity, human beings are essentially, our societies run on economy, buying and selling, trade, all that sort of stuff. Without that, we wouldn't really have a society or civilization. Well, according to the Western world, we wouldn't. So receipts, economy, and even money itself is printed on paper, isn't it? We've got buildings, which is a very interesting one, incredibly important. We live in buildings, we work in buildings. Buildings are where we have shelter, buildings are where we eat, we do everything inside. If we didn't have buildings, we wouldn't have homes, we wouldn't have schools, we wouldn't have anything really. So buildings, which are of course constructed by architects, which actually an architect is mentioned in the poem, and I think this is done on purpose because architects design buildings on paper. So even something as big and massive as a building always started off being designed on paper, didn't it, by an architect? So everything goes back to paper. Paper is the origin. Paper is the thing that we write on. Paper is, I guess, the representation of humanity. Everything we do links to paper. Now, in the next breath, Dharker, having said that paper is incredibly important and represents humanity, is incredibly strong, in the next breath, she says that paper lets the light shine through. So paper is also translucent, and translucent essentially means an object which lets light through. So it's immediately shown to be quite weak, at least physically. This paper is, I guess, vulnerable. So we've established that paper is weak and vulnerable, but we've also established that paper constructs a lot of what humanity is and values and lives in and cherishes. We are built up of paper. So we've got this immediate contrast between the weakness of paper. There's a reason that the poem is called Tissue. It's the weakest kind of paper. It lets light through, it's vulnerable, it's thin, it seems like it could break very easily, but at the same time, it is exactly what humanity is built up on. So I think Dharker is making some very interesting and complicated points about what humanity is built up of. It's strong, it's passed down, but also it's incredibly weak at the same time. Tissue also has another meaning, and that is cell tissue. We are literally biologically made up of tissues, aren't we? We've got skin tissue, we've got cell tissue, we've got muscle tissue, connective tissue. Tissue is everywhere. It's what we are. So it's not only what we represent or what we kind of physically pass down or what we kind of physically use in order to buy or sell, or what we draw on in order to construct buildings. It's not this like medium that we use in order to be who we are. It's also who we are. It's literally what we are made up of. And of course, the last line of the poem is, and I'm bringing up the last line because I think it's an incredibly important last line, and it sums up the entire poem. So essentially, I think what Dharker is trying to say is that, yes, we are made up of cell tissue, and that is a constant reminder throughout the poem, but it also showcases how we value and rely on paper. And paper, which is a physical object, essentially, because we rely on it so much, we rely on these religious texts, we rely on receipts, which represent economy, we rely on buildings and living in buildings, and so much more. Maps, I think, are mentioned as well, so we can travel and get to know more people and connect. That's also a form of paper. But yes, we essentially are that paper. Because we rely on it so much, we essentially embody it. We embody paper, and we are paper. So now that we've gone over essentially, hopefully, gone over the theme of humanity and how it links to the word tissue, let's actually go on to talk about how these themes connect and what themes actually are shown in the poem. Now, according to me, I think that these are the most important themes in the poem. We've got humanity, obviously, fragility, connection, recording. You could say that these two are pretty much linked together through the idea of memory. So remembering something through records, which all link to the idea of memory in itself, using records, physical records, in order to remember things. Transformation and power. So we talked a little bit about some of these themes. So for example, we talked a lot about humanity, and I think that is quite an obvious theme because the whole of tissue essentially reflects what Dharker believes humanity is / values. So essentially, humanity values paper. It values the things that are written on paper. It values all the things that paper represents. And I think this links very much to connection, because Dharker actually does a lot of connecting in the poem. She connects paper to memory, or to a means used to remember, to legacy, essentially. So paper isn't just paper. It's not just a blank sheet of paper. It's a way to remember people by. We've got paper that lets the light shine through. Yes, so we're talking about paper. Paper thinned by age or touching. And then we've got where a hand has written in the names and histories of who was born to whom. So these names and histories and who was born to whom really showcases how paper, which is thinned, which lets the light through, which is seemingly quite a fragile thing, and again, we've got the theme of fragility here, so paper is fragile, but it also is a way of remembering people and remembering the legacy that they've left behind, the names and histories and who was born to whom, this idea of legacy through family, and that is a way that Dharker has connected paper to things that are bigger than the actual paper itself. It's symbolic connection. Does that make sense? Something seemingly small like paper is used to symbolize much bigger things like history, like legacy, like family trees, but also just the idea of connection in the poem as well. We've got the connection of religious texts like the Quran to history, to legacy, to names. So we've got connection between people, connection between families, connection between our ancestors and ourselves, which is all used through paper. Now that is a complicated topic, so we're going to have a summary at the end of each frame, remember that. So I talked a little bit about fragility as well, didn't I? And even in the first two stanzas I've got here, fragility is mentioned, it's referenced to. So fragility, or something that is fragile or vulnerable, is referenced to. We've got paper that lets the light shine through, paper thinned by age or touching. And tissue itself is an incredibly vulnerable thing. It's very thin. And I think this really, like we said, tissue represents humanity. I think this is Dharker's way of saying that humanity itself is vulnerable, very easily ruined and easily, shattered and scattered. Now, human beings are incredibly fragile, aren't they? We don't last forever. So it's not just humanity as a whole, it's also a kind of observation about human beings and how fragile we are. We don't last forever, we die very easily. And I think this links to the idea of recording and remembering. This idea of being incredibly fragile as human beings, needing to record and remember ourselves so that we don't disappear, so that we don't kind of fall off and get forgotten. Human beings know that they're fragile, their bodies are incredibly fragile, but they have the power, we have the power to record ourselves and have birth certificates and have family trees which are written all on paper, and we use that paper to remember who we are. So there's this idea, I think, connection between fragility and, I guess, human beings knowing that they're fragile and using that fragility as a way of recording and remembering and kind of carrying on a legacy, I guess you could say. And lastly, we've got the two themes at the bottom here, transformation and power. Now, I think the idea of transformation can connect very well with, see what I did there? Connection. The two are quite similar. However, obviously, connection means the idea of things connecting, obviously, and transformation is something turning into something else. I think both are shown in the poem. I think transformation is used to show how human beings essentially transform into paper. And I think this is shown through, I mentioned the last line, which is turned into your skin, really reflects this idea of transformation. And really, this transformation is used to aid other themes. So this idea of paper essentially turning into people, or people turning into paper, really aids the other themes. It helps the other themes. This idea of connection, of fragility, this idea that paper is fragile and so is humanity, that human beings essentially put so much, I guess, effort into paper. They put so much of themselves into paper that they essentially become paper. Human beings construct their societies around paper. Think about money. This is a great example if you're confused. Think about money and notes. For example, a £50 note or a £100 note. Think about money and how that is something that human beings essentially build themselves around, right? And money in note form, and especially back in 2006 when this poem was published, money was in the form of paper back then, a lot more than it is now. And think about how human beings construct themselves around money and how they essentially, become money in a way, and money is paper. I think this links very well as well with power. And obviously this is a direct kind of, I guess you could say, contrast with fragility. Power and fragility are two very different things, they're opposites almost. But I definitely think this poem talks about fragility as much as it talks about power. So this poem talks about, I think, the power that paper has and how paper physically is fragile, but it represents something strong and long-lasting. That's incredibly important. Now look at these first two stanzas. They really do represent the way that fragility and power go hand in hand. We've got paper that lets the light shine through. So here we go. Immediately, this paper is fragile, it's translucent, it's almost see-through. However, she's written in the next bit, this is what could alter things, and this, I think, showcases how powerful paper is, that paper has the power to alter things, alter meaning change, of course. So it's paper that lets the light shine through, weak and seemingly very vulnerable. It looks very thin, but it has the power to change, to alter, to move things, to essentially construct humanity. Yeah, it's complicated. There's a lot of, I guess, contrasting ideas in the poem. There's not one way to interpret the poem. It's however you want to look at the poem. And of course, you are, remember, allowed to contradict yourself in the exam. You are allowed to say, if it's a contradicting poem, you are allowed to say that themes contradict themselves. This is an incredibly layered poem, guys. Like, it's obviously going to be very confusing and have a lot of layered themes, because I think it really represents what humanity is, how complicated and multi-dimensional humanity is. just some background context about Dharker. So first things first, Dharker herself calls herself a Scottish Muslim Calvinist. So she was actually raised in Glasgow from the age of 1, I think, yes, 1, from the age of 1, but she was born in Pakistan, and she's a Calvinist, so she, I guess, has kind of connections to Christianity. Calvinism is a type of Protestantism, by the way. So that's very important, I think, from the jump, because it really reflects the idea of connection. And remember, that is a huge theme in Tissue and in a lot of her other poems, this idea of interconnection, or different parts of humanity becoming connected. At the end of the day, the poem is about humans. And remember the reference to the Quran as well. There's this connection to religion. And I think Dharker purposefully uses the Quran in her poem because she is herself Muslim, but also I think just to refer to a religious text which is connected to history, to age, to kind of antiquity. This idea of connection and humanity and religion is huge, and I think it's present in Dharker's own life. She's connected to religion, she's connected to Pakistan, she's connected to Glasgow, she's connected to England. She currently lives in the UK, by the way. She lives in London. Another thing that I think is really important about Dharker is that she's very culturally displaced, and I've talked about this already, but I want to talk about it a little bit more because I think it really is important for why Tissue is the poem that it is. This idea of being kind of moved around, or having travelled a lot. Dharker actually travels to India quite a lot and makes documentaries as well, which I think is really important in showcasing her personality. She actually is a filmmaker, so she is quite, I guess, an active woman. She travels from place to place. She's well travelled. And yeah, she's culturally displaced in the sense that she was born in Pakistan, lived in Glasgow, and now she lives in the UK and splits her time between Mumbai in India and London. And I think this idea of breaking borders and travelling and kind of being this travelled woman really also reflects itself in Tissue through the theme of I guess you could, again, connectedness and kind of movement, although that's not a theme, but this idea of movement and breaking borders is definitely present in the poem. We've got that quote, the sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds, which I think is a direct reference to the idea of humanity breaking borders and travelling from place to place, using maps as I guess a symbol to showcase travel and movement. Dharker herself is so used to moving and travelling, going from place to place in order to showcase her documentaries, and I guess she's basically an activist, I guess you could say. She creates movies and documentaries about women and children in India. A lot of her focus in her movies is on education for women and children, and just kind of oppressed societies as well. She talks a lot about that and those things in her documentaries. So I guess the idea of moving in order to improve and expose societies and expose, not necessarily in a bad way, but yeah, reveal and expose different societies to a wide range of people through documentaries and filmmaking. I think, yeah, Tissue definitely showcases this idea of humanity being this interconnected and, I guess, close species who, at the end of the day, are all the same, even though there are different sects and different societies. Everyone is pretty much the same. Everyone wants to carry this legacy down. Everyone is connected, and everyone is, at the end of the day, human, made up of cell tissue, made up of skin tissue. Lastly, I just want to talk about Dharker's other works which might connect to Tissue. So Dharker actually has an anthology called The Terrorist at My Table, published in 2006, and Tissue was one of the poems within this anthology. So Tissue was published in this anthology of poems, and one of the other poems in this anthology is called The Right Word, and it talks about it's post 9/11, so it was written not long after 9/11 happened, and it talks about the idea of terrorism and what the right word is for a terrorist, essentially, and it brings up themes which you can actually search this poem up if you want, but it brings up themes such as how someone becomes a terrorist, and the idea of humanity and connection is also present in this poem. It talks about alienation of Muslims essentially, and the way that people treat or talk about terrorists in the right. Again, yeah, it's available online, so you can search it up yourself. But essentially, the point of the poem is about what to call a terrorist, and you know what is the meaning behind the word essentially, and who are terrorists. I think this is an incredibly important poem to look at if you do want to look at a socio-historic context around the poem Tissue, because it brings up very similar themes. The idea, I've talked a lot about this theme and idea, but connection, which seems to spring up in a lot of Dharker's life, a lot of aspects of Dharker's life, but also in her poems, this idea that all humans are equal. She really likes to stress this, and she likes to ponder this idea of humanity and what humanity is. A lot of her poems also focus very heavily on religion and aspects of religion. There's actually a quote here by Dharker herself that I want to bring up because I think it links very well to her principles, her ideas, and what she writes a lot of her poems about. And I think this links very well to Tissue, so just ignore that bit. But she says, "I don't want to have to define myself in terms of location or religion. In a world that seems to be splitting itself into narrower national and religious groups, sects, castes, subcastes, we can go on excluding others until we come down to a minority of one." And I think this is an incredibly important quote when we look at Dharker's themes and how she views humanity. She doesn't want to define herself in any particular one caste. She's not just one thing, she's many things. She's a Scottish, she's Muslim, she's Christian. She says she's adopted by India. She says she's married into Wales. She was actually Chancellor of Newcastle as well, and she also lives in London, so she's, you know, lives in England as well, but she splits her time in India. So she's, you know, very, very varied. She's got many, I guess you could say, identities or groups that she belongs to. She's not just one thing. And I guess in a way, her kind of identity encompasses many different cultures. And I think her poems, such as Tissue, encompasses the many. Tissue encompasses humanity as a whole, not as sects, not as religious groups, not as different parts of religion. It's humanity as a whole, and this idea of everyone wanting to last forever, or everyone being made up of cell tissue, and everyone writing down their birth charts and legacies. Everyone has a family, everyone wants to last, everyone wants to travel, everyone wants to cross boundaries. And I think in including these topics in her poem, Dharker herself crosses boundaries. I think through writing poems such as Tissue, such as The Right Word, Dharker seeks to connect. I've written this word so many times, but yeah, she seeks to connect different groups of people together. And I think that's why she writes a lot about Muslim religion, about South Asian culture a lot as well, because she realizes that a lot of her audience will perhaps not belong to the South Asian culture. And so in writing about it, she connects different cultures together. She connects Western culture with South Asian culture. Now, this isn't obvious in Tissue, this reference to South Asian culture. However, there is a mention of buildings. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. And we can quite easily say, knowing that Dharker takes an interest in a lot of Southeast Asian culture, and a lot of especially, you know, the way that Muslims are perceived and the way that Indians are perceived, and she takes a special interest in India and Pakistan in particular as well. We can easily connect, knowing this idea of buildings being paper, to 9/11. I think it's not really far-fetched to say that. 9/11, of course, being the crash of two planes into the Twin Towers in 2001. So if buildings were paper, I think could definitely reference the terrorist attack that happened then. And I think this connects very well to the idea of different religions and different cultures, and how these different cultures are perceived, and how they can sometimes be disastrous in many, many ways. Not just disastrous because of the attack, but disastrous because of the aftermath of the attack and the way that many brown people were discriminated against in the Western world. I think this is definitely a reference, and I think an example of fragility, how human beings are so fragile, not just in the fact that we're mortal and that we're easily able to die, but that we're so flawed in the way we think, flawed in the way we discriminate against each other. And she says, if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away. And I think this idea of easily falling, yes, she's talking about buildings, but I think she can also talk about the way humanity falls so easily in the face of discrimination, in the face of being opposed to each other, in the face of having sects and religions which separate us from each other instead of link us to each other. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at form and structure. And here we have the whole poem. So the first thing to notice about the form and structure is that each stanza has 4 lines. And then we've got the last stanza, which is 1 line. So from 1 to 9, 4 lines per stanza. And then the 10th stanza, and this is its own stanza, is 1 line. So we've got this seeming, I guess you could say, regularity in the structure of the poem. It looks quite regular. We've got 4 lines per stanza, and then at the end we're kind of shocked by the 1 line on its own. And this is a very important line, I think, and there's a reason why this 1 line at the very end of the poem has been kind of separated out. And when we look at the content of this line, turned into your skin, we see that it's almost as if Dharker is revealing something. The rest of the stanzas are very, you could say, vague, almost metaphorical. Nothing is clearly explained, and it's put into this rigid kind of structure. So there's this contrast. You could call it contrast because there's a rigid structure, 4 line per stanza, but the content of it is not quite clear. We're not too sure what Dharker is talking about. We're not too sure what Dharker is trying to say. It's all in this extended metaphor. But this last line, which breaks the regular structure of the stanzas before it, actually is interestingly the most clear stanza. Its content is the most clear. It's obvious here that Dharker is revealing that the paper, that the tissue that she is previously talking about has been turned into your skin. This poem isn't about tissue. It's not about the object tissue. That tissue is an extended metaphor which goes on and on and on in vague terms, only to be revealed. That tissue is your skin. It's my skin. It's everyone's skin. It's human skin. Now the next thing that's quite interesting is how this rigid 4 lines per stanza gives an initial idea that the poem might be quite rigid, might be quite tight. It might be quite straightforward. What I mean by this is that usually when we look at poems with very kind of rigid lines per stanza, the topic itself is usually quite clear and the content is usually quite straightforward. Now what's interesting is that even though there's 4 lines per stanza, it's overall the poem as a whole has quite a clear structure to it. There's so much enjambment that the content, what Dharker is actually talking about, is unclear. So we look at this poem, we think, oh, it's straightforward. Upon first glance, it seems quite obvious that the poem might be about one particular thing, because the structure deceives us into making us think that the poem is tight, rigid, it's got a clear idea. However, when we actually read it, there's a huge amount of enjambment, which I guess scatters the poem. It makes it less clear. Let's read through. We've got paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching, the kind you find in well-used books. So even though we've got 4 lines per stanza, the actual content, the actual topic goes on to the next stanza itself. It's not that each stanza has its own topic. There's a kind of it goes on. There's commas at the end of each stanza. It's all one big chunk. It's not a neat poem. It's actually written in something called free verse, which means there's no rhyme or regularity. There's no clear rhythm to the poem. But also, I think this freedom of verse also could represent how there's no particular topic per stanza. The topic bleeds into the next stanza, bleeds into the next stanza. So this topic isn't neat, it's not concise, it's not packed. It's almost free in itself. Another thing about this poem that's interesting isn't just how the stanzas bleed into each other, but how the lines themselves seem to bleed into each other. And by this I mean that one line is fragmented in a way. So we've got here, paper that lets the light, goes on to there, shine through, comma, this is what could alter things. She doesn't start off her first line with paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. That would be a lot neater. Instead, she decides to break up that sentence and put it into another line. So it's paper that lets the light, pause, shine through, pause. This is what could alter things. Pause between this and is. So there's constant pauses, even within the very first stanza, that makes the reading quite uncomfortable. It's not a straightforward or neat or easy read because of how many pauses there are. And this poem has been described as quite a flowy poem, by the way. It's not a rigid structural poem. It's not very neat. It flows on and flows on. It's not got any rules to it, really. I think this is interesting because this really reflects, well, first of all, it reflects the tissue itself, the tissue paper itself, which is quite flowing. Like, by this I mean essentially like when you look at a tissue, or maybe when you throw it in the air, it kind of flows down. It's not heavy, it's not weighed down by anything. And I guess this is reflected through the structure. It's not weighed down by rules. It's very flimsy, just like a tissue is flimsy. But I think another way of viewing these fragmented lines is looking at what a tissue represents, which is, as we've established, humanity. And we've said that Dharker is attempting through everything in the poem, through the use of the language, through the use of structure, to really reflect her views on humanity, to really show what she believes humanity represents and symbolises. So we've talked about how Dharker likes unity. She values unity. She herself has many different cultures and many different backgrounds within her. Remember, we said that she was a Scottish Muslim Calvinist. She herself has many different cultures within her. She is not just one thing. And I think this really shows through the structure itself that there's not one topic per stanza or one even topic per line. There's a lot of bleeding on onto the next. And yeah, definitely I think through the structure represents what Dharker is trying to say about how she wants humanity to be, I guess, or how she sees humanity. Humanity is not split up. It's not that, one religion represents all of humanity. Humanity is built up of human beings, first and foremost. Not different castes, not different religions, but one representation. We're all human at the end of the day. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about the rhyme in the poem. Now, remember, this is a free verse poem. And by that means it has no regular rhyme scheme. However, it does have the occasional rhyme, which shows up randomly. So for example, Quran, hand, which is a half rhyme, roads, mountain folds, brick, break, and make, and also block. I guess you could say similar sounding words, half rhymes, drift and shift, which is a full rhyme, height, weight, date. So we've got height and weight, which are half rhymes, and then weight and date, which are full rhymes. So I'm going to leave it there. If you find some more half rhymes, you can definitely pick them out, but it's not going to lie, it's kind of boring. But yes, we've got quite a few half and full rhymes, more half rhymes and full rhymes. Everything that the poet does, that Dharker is doing, is purposeful. Just remember that. So Every single half rhyme or full rhyme is supposed to be analysed. It's done for a reason. Now, when we think about why a lot of this poem has kind of an irregular structure or no regular rhyme scheme, and then all of a sudden we've got the occasional rhyme or half rhyme come up. What does this tell us about the words which are meant to be rhyming? What does this tell us? Well, first of all, I think it tells us that any words which sound the same are meant to be noticed, and they have a connection with each other. So, for example, when we look at Quran and hand, these two words are meant to pop out to us because of how they sound in the mouth. They are similar sounding words. When we think of the fact that Quran and hand really jump out to us, we think about the idea of maybe a hand holding a Quran, or maybe a hand touching the Quran. There's this idea of touching or possessing or holding. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. See how easily they fall away on a sigh. A shift. Again, this idea of drift and shift, and that full rhyme give the idea of vulnerability, of flimsiness, of something which drifts but also shifts. It's movement here that is brought out by these two words which rhyme. They pop out and they really make us think about the idea of movement, of shifting, of flimsiness even. Again, roads and mountain folds, the idea of maps, the topic of travelling, the idea of a road being something which cars drive on or people walk on, and mountain folds being more natural, nature. There's contrast between nature and man-made things, which roads are man-made. We've also got brick, block, break, make. Again, this idea of sturdiness, brick, blocks, these kind of structures. And then we've got make, this idea of who makes structures. Humanity. We've also, through these words, got this idea of building, of sturdiness. Why? Why does Dharker want us to notice these words? What kind of thoughts do they highlight in us? I definitely believe that rhyme and half rhymes even really pick apart certain words and make us think about the connection that those words have with each other and with the poem as a whole. So it's very, very important to look at the way that words sound, read them out loud a couple of times and see if you can find any more half rhymes, and then see why. Why would Dharker decide to rhyme this word with that? What does it suggest? But now let's look at the rhyme scheme as a whole. The rhyme scheme doesn't have any kind of solid structure, which links to the idea that there's no solid kind of no solid topic per stanza. There's not even a solid line which makes sense without going into the next. It's all kind of, like I said, scattered. It's all free verse. It's all kind of vague and vulnerable and susceptible to criticism in a way. You know, there's no strong structure. And I think this very much links to the idea of if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift. See how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift. There's this idea that the structure of the poem is representing physical structures like buildings, like humanity. They're vulnerable, I guess, in a way. Just in the same way that buildings are vulnerable, the structure of this poem is incredibly vulnerable. It's incredibly scattered. It definitely seems strong through the 4 lines per stanza. When we look at it visually, it looks strong, but when we delve deeper, we see how vulnerable and how weak this structure is, how susceptible it is to breaking apart. One of the great things about tissue is that it has many different meanings, and I think that is one of the reasons why people get so confused with it, because you can come up with loads of, I guess, contrasting things that Dharker is trying to say. It's not like there's one simple topic or one simple point that she's trying to make. I believe she's trying to make many, many points, and I've said this before, but these points kind of conflict or contrast with each other for a reason. I think they represent this idea that humans and humanity have different ideas which often contrast with each other. Now, this is a great poem, but it can also be quite complicated. So I've decided to add a slide here at the end, just rationalising why this poem was even under the power and conflict part of the anthology. Let's start with power, because I think power is a little bit easier than conflict. So I think one of the ways that tissue showcases power is through the power of paper. Now, I definitely think paper is used to symbolise humanity's desire to last. And by last, I essentially mean it symbolizes humanity's need to carry on a legacy. We've got examples of the Quran. This is an example of a religious text which has been passed down for centuries and represents a whole religion, Islam. It showcases how Islam has its own legacy, and I guess in a way represents all religions. Every single religious text has carried on this long, long legacy in line. It shapes and forms the way that human beings think. It's an example of religion and its impact. Long after great religious leaders have died, long after even prophets have died, their legacy has continued, and the legacy that religion has left behind is hugely important. It is a great example of how humanity believes in the power of religion, and it's all written down on paper, isn't it? The Quran, the Bible, the Torah, every single religious text is written on paper first and foremost. So this paper, I guess, represents the impact of religion, and as a consequence reflects the impact of human beings' desire for legacy. We've also got stuff like birth certificates. So, for example, in the second stanza, Dharker writes, where a hand has written in the names and histories of who was born to whom. Notice the reference to written. We're of course going to be looking at the language in our next video, but written, I think, is a very important word here. It's a very important noun. It's a very important noun here. It showcases that everything that's been passed down, family trees, birth certificates, for example, has been written down first and foremost on paper. We've got stuff like receipts, the power of economy, which of course is hugely powerful. Receipts symbolize the impact of the economy on humanity. So I'm not going to go on too much about each type of paper that's been referred to, but I think the point that I'm trying to make is that each piece of paper or written work, the Quran, birth certificates, family trees, receipts, etc., all represent a way for humanity to have power, and so therefore paper itself represents humanity's power. We've also got, I think, and I haven't talked too much about this, but power of nature. Now, I've talked about human mortality quite a bit, that humans don't last forever, that they die. And I think this could link very well to this idea that nature has power over humans. Nature, that's this nature by the way, nature can outlive and outlast humans. When we look at the stanza that mentions buildings, it says, it's the fourth stanza down, it said, if buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. So we've got a reference here to nature, the wind, and the fragility of buildings. And buildings, of course, are an example of a structure that humanity has built up. And Dharker basically alludes to the idea that something natural, the wind, has the power to completely destroy the human structure. That the wind has the power to completely destroy buildings, which seem so sturdy. We've also got a lot of references to the idea of light. Light breaking through paper. An example of this is even the first is the first sentence. Paper that lets the light shine through. We've also got a reference to daylight breaking through capitals and monoliths. So on the 8th stanza, Dharker actually writes, let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths. That's the direct quote. So capitals, of course, representing perhaps capital cities, and monoliths are essentially stone structures that humans build. So yes, this idea of daylight breaking that, even through this metaphorical language or personification, but the idea of the verb breaks, that daylight is breaking these monoliths. Daylight and light is shining through paper, is shining through monoliths, shining through structures. Really, I think reflects this idea that nature can outlast humanity. I think this links very well to the idea that humans don't last forever, that humans eventually die, eventually decompose. I've talked a little bit about the last sentence of the poem. We've got this idea that paper smooths and becomes thin and transparent, which turns into your skin. And I've talked a bit about what this could mean. And one of the interpretations that I've come up with is this idea that paper is a metaphor, of course, for skin. But this last line could also represent death. This idea that paper becomes translucent, becomes thin, could be a representation of what happens when you are dead, how your skin eventually breaks apart, how it decomposes. This last line could very much symbolize death. It could symbolize what happens to a corpse almost, that your skin doesn't remain on your bones forever. It eventually decomposes and becomes a part of nature. And this, I guess, is a representation of human mortality, and more importantly, how nature eventually takes over your body and eventually ends up, your body eventually ends up being a part of nature, ends up kind of surrendering to nature. So nature holds a great amount of power. And lastly, we've got conflict. And I've talked a bit about conflict, but I think conflict is very important in the poem, as I said, because a lot of the themes conflict each other. We've got power versus fragility. We've got the idea of paper being both powerful and vulnerable, depending on what it represents. We've got paper representing legacy, but we've also got paper representing human structures which don't last in the face of death and don't last in the face of human tragedy. For example, we talked about 9/11, which essentially was the destruction of a human structure. We've got kind of the idea that religion, which is human structure, doesn't last very long, but also the idea that religion is an important thing. So a lot of conflicting ideas, which represents humanity as something which is permanently conflicted. Because we are all built up of different people with different ideas, I think this idea of conflict is very, very, it's stressed in the poem because it represents how humanity and different human beings are incredibly conflicted and incredibly at war with each other. There's this constant idea of unity being at conflict with separation. Ultimately, we've got human life as something which is powerful in the fact that it leaves a legacy, but it's also something that's easily destroyed. I think if you get to the heart of this, you really get to the heart of the poem. If you let yourself have different interpretations and be a bit creative with this poem, don't try to find one true meaning. Find many, many different meanings, and don't be afraid to find meanings which oppose each other. I think when you do that, you get to the true nature of the poem. It doesn't reflect one thing. It doesn't tell you about one thing. It doesn't mean one thing. It means many different things.